Hello friends and comrades, and you're very welcome to the MCP channel today. Now, I'm sure if you've had any interaction with them, you will have realised that most leftists have the idealist view of language, where in the dialectic of content and form has the last say to them as opposed to content. As such, they think that airtight, unchanging definitions contain the entire meaning of concepts in a static and eternal way. Applied to concepts like the working class, it is the assumption that 19th century definitions can exist forever, and that there have been no changes in the relations to production demanding a new analysis. The materialist seeks to get to the essence of things, to investigate the deeper reason why the working class has historically been associated with the sale of labour, and not just use this string of words as a criteria to morally accuse, for example, farmers or small business owners or to scrutinise organisations which represent their interests as being fascistic, the latter point not even being from original Marxism. Even the former doesn't correlate to our current reality or make any sense to understand class today. The notion that owning anything disqualifies you from being working class, especially with the transformation towards the gig economy and the fourth industrial revolution, would deem delivery drivers who own their own bikes, Uber drivers who own their own cars, owner-operated truckers, and many common-sense working-class groups as not working class. Well, let's even look at more traditionally in the trades. An electrician who owns his own tools and equipment would somehow not be a true proletarian if that is dogmatically defined as someone with only their labour to sell. At face value, this is ridiculous. People who own their own means of subsistence, the small harming farmers, as they were in Lenin's development of capitalism in Russia, are characterised as petite bourgeois by leftists and condemned as being privileged and demonised in their moralising rhetoric. But homes, cars, phones are all owned by the working class today, and this is a result of a new social contract formed between the imperialist state and the working class to maintain the state's position against the widespread discontent following the crash of '29, where the old laissez-faire liberal approach was abandoned, and it became concerned with ensuring a minimum level of security for the working class. This social interest became a political concern. The form of ownership that these policies permitted to the working class, the things like homes, cars, etc., was not a capitalist one, where you would fully own something just totally impersonally at the discretion of your whim, and you can do whatever you want with this object as it is in traditional liberalism. Instead, this is a form of ownership which is facilitative in nature. The working class that now own cars and arguably phones. I mean, how can you even access the labour market today without a phone? It does not own these things in the same way as a landlord owned land, but they own these things to facilitate them being able to do their jobs in the first place, and on the aggregate level, to facilitate the reproduction of the mode of production, which due to factors like technical development and the experiences of mass pauperism and unemployment, without these basic forms of property, it would mean that the mode of production would collapse if, say, the working class were not afforded some things to even be able to do their jobs or get to them or be content enough, healthy enough, etc. to be useful and keep the gears turning. So everyone now is given a small gear in the machine for themselves, but this is a compound as opposed to a static form of property, because it compounds the labour of the working class via a functional form of property. Hazeldine, the ACP chairman, has described things such as cars, homes and phones as a substrate, only atop which can that traditional Marxist relationship of the proletariat selling their labour actually begin to occur. It is a prerequisite that they have this substrate which reproduces the conditions of this new social contract of the post-war state, i.e. the working class having enough basic securities and ability to access labour which keeps them content. And then with that as a given, then they assume their role as a labourer. The forces of production have accelerated to the point where labour takes more property to even do. And as such, nowadays, for something like the smartphone, the state actually has an interest in everyone owning one, just like they did with cars back in the 50s, because the changing nature of the job due to the development of the forces of production, like people going to further workplaces or people having to engage with their job using the internet, it means that owning these things now is necessary just to facilitate production continuing. Since the property that characterises today's working class is not only facilitating the mode of production constantly, but since it compounds their labour, it is very intimate and integral to them, and it's not something which they can distance themselves from, as in the classical liberal model of ownership, as the landlord does with land or the capitalist does with these impersonal commodities. It is akin to the relationship the peasant has to the land that they grow their own food on, not that of a landlord at a distance to the same land. So the question is, what historically defines the peasantry? In countries such as Russia and China, the peasantry were not the poorest of the poor and the most desperate, but the ones who had some form of security, usually in the land that they could just about live off, guaranteeing themselves some minimum level of subsistence. Since the New Deal social contracts in the West, the proletariat has almost been fused with, or at least acquired properties of the peasantry, whilst retaining the proletarian characteristic of selling its labour. Some people will say that Mao has no relevance in the West, since these countries are not rural societies, as China was at the time. But what I want to emphasise is that what constitutes the peasantry is not bound by an agrarian society. It's not bound by this. Rather, it refers to the more fundamental basis of institutional power, which is defined with peasantry and is not eliminated with feudalism. In fact, Lenin discovered this by recognising what had been termed as the democratic petite bourgeoisie as being peasantry itself, and hence revolutionary. This was in contradiction to the line of the Mensheviks, who believed in this model of linear development of history, where the proletariat should align with the emerging big liberal urban bourgeoisie, because these supposedly represented a newer mode of production, which is capitalism, which in their eyes was more advanced and further along this straight line than the backwards feudalism that the peasantry were meant to be from. Lenin, on the other hand, had a more dialectical view of history, which did not accept this linear view, but looked to the essential basis of that new emergent class, and realised that this class even being possible, with enough free time and resources to experiment, and all actually rested upon the back of the apparently stagnant and backwards order in the countryside, saying in chapter 2 of the development of capitalism in Russia that labour service presupposes and requires the middle peasant, which is that the class that reproduces the mode of production and the conditions of labour to be even sold, the one which is the vital source of the power of institutions and the very existence of the urban classes. By returning to what was older and apparently more backwards and primitive, he arrived at the foundation and was able to use this as the basis and the engine for change. This is a dialectic that endures beyond feudalism and the small-holding subject of today, given that security via a compound form of property as the basis for which to sell their labour represents the peasantry in the West. Much of this modern-day peasantry, even owning something to facilitate their labour, are indentured and work in constant debt, which means that their truck or the equipment that they need to have to start selling their labour to begin with, often even phones like I said before, they don't actually buy at all, but are loaned, and then they're paying off the debt or mortgage from that. This is what Lenin meant, saying that in the majority of cases the middle peasant cannot make ends meet without resorting to loans. They only aspire to own their own land, shop, etc. You see this with the peasants under the landlords in the Chinese Civil War, that's their aspiration. But the threat that this class is actually faced with on the day-to-day to their survival is not being able to pay off this debt, which is the historical way that landlords always separated peasants from their means of production, which in feudalism typically was land. And if you've been on Twitter, I'm sure that you've noticed the strange thing that often no difference is made between people who might own one lorry or one premise for their business and those with multiple in the class analysis of the leftists on there. It's a very important distinction to make, because someone who owns 50 lorries and hires people to drive them is not the same as someone who owns their own land or their own building or their own lorry and isn't exploiting anyone. Lenin thought as much when he described the middle peasantry, which were what were called the democratic petite bourgeoisie, who owned their own land, but the middle peasantry, which were the majority, was contrasted with the projected separations into bourgeois and proletarian forms of peasantry, which itself was a process which never fully came to properly manifest. But the actual term petite bourgeoisie that the leftists are so obsessed with is, to be honest, fairly meaningless, as it was used variably to refer to the middle peasantry, who Lenin said were not wealthy, or the peasant bourgeoisie, who very much were. Lenin saw this middle peasantry, to be more specific, as a revolutionary class, albeit that the proletariat should lead it, in his view, which is where Mao would differ, based upon the experience of the urban working class betraying the revolution after 1917. Lenin, however, by advocating the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, contradicted the orthodox Marxist of his day. This strategy broke from all other social democrats, really setting Lenin apart, more than even his theories of imperialism, which Kautsky also would give lip service to being against. The success of this led to a new synthesis, Marxism-Leninism, and defined Stalin's base of support. Then, the synthesis of Mao Zedong thought goes even further than this. Mao rejected the necessity of having the base in the urban proletariat at all, which actually led to some tension with Stalin in private during the early years, as he did not even consider Mao a true Marxist. Mao's actual foundation was primarily the peasantry, and although most had to pay rent to landlords still, they attended to their own lands, but were subsistence farmers who owned partially and aspired to own fully their own means of subsistence, like in Russia. But Mao's precise reason for popularity was his promise that they would be able to fully own them by deposing the landlords, you see. He was loved because he promised them that they could eventually own for themselves their own means of subsistence, something seen as petite bourgeois politics by leftists. And although most peasants were under the landlords still, Mao gladly accepted the support of the ones who were already owning their own land, and beyond that the support of even the so-called urban petite bourgeoisie and even the big bourgeoisie, providing that they were anti-imperialist. I mean, in your own time, take a look into the symbolism of the 4 small stars on the Chinese flag. And although one of those stars, part of this alliance, was the proletariat, Mao never possessed any sort of strong or primary base in the industrial working class, which Lenin had still believed was necessary to lead the alliance so that the proletarian aspect would be brought out within the middle peasant. So that's the jump between Lenin and Mao, and why Mao is very helpful today when we look around us. There is little working class that's not imbued with any aspect of the peasantry anymore. It's hard to find this pure proletariat to put at the leadership of any movement. Let's take a step back. Why though do leftists see those who own their own means of subsistence as being petite bourgeois in the first place? The leftist class analysis does not refer to the relations of production, but is more interested in managerial questions. Because they are not managed by someone, these people who own their own means of subsistence get classified as petite bourgeois and are demonized, whereas even cushy salaried professionals like Google coders or and the most ludicrous analyses, university professors, can often be seen by these people in their twisted view as more truer workers to them, because these people have a boss who breathes down their neck, and technically the company or whatever the institution they're working for owns all the property. They don't own what they're using themselves and all the equipment. They're only owning their labour that they sell. So you see, these are the ridiculous conclusions that you reach by dogmatically treating definitions from the 19th century as a checklist to impose on reality, rather than trying to discern from that time what the meaning and the phenomenon in reality of what the definition was trying to express was, and trying to look for that today on a deeper level. This is indicative that in the 21st century, such a dogmatic analysis of labour power and value on the individual level is unsustainable, and that a new analysis of capital is necessary. But maybe that's something we need to do in depth in another video. But to leftists, actual ownership of a means of production doesn't matter anymore. As far as class is concerned, only the cultural connotations of not having a manager is what defines the class distinction. These people who own their own means of subsistence are too independent, and sociologically this is a form of consciousness that these leftists find uncomfortable. So you'll see these types of people will use Marxist language and jargon to label and accuse and condemn the supposedly uneducated, barbarous and fascistic petite bourgeoisie and middle classes, which are actually the working class. And when you look at who they're condemning and who they hate, it's the majority of the population, and they hate them and they sneer at them and they look down on them in this conceited way. Like Trotsky, they loathe the masses. Meanwhile, then, they don't have to go to the hard effort of understanding where these people are coming from, their subjectivity and perspective, or speak to them on their level. They don't have to humble themselves and listen, because that's hard work, and they will often have different opinions and outlooks to the leftists. It's much less challenging for a leftist university student to write all those stupid brutes off and restrict themselves to only trying to form a base of support amongst graduate students who, surprise surprise, conveniently share a consciousness much like their own. But why, we have to ask, do the leftists accuse this working class peasantry fusion who own their own means of subsistence to sell their labour as being petite bourgeois specifically, like it's such a damning condemnation? Where is this specific emphasis on the petite bourgeoisie coming from in their analysis? It is because they have the Trotskyite view that fascism emerges from the middle classes, from the petite bourgeoisie. That's why they're always accusing all the working class people who they hate of being petite bourgeoisie, so they can write them off as fascists. Leon Trotsky said in What is National Socialism that there are particles of Hitler in all small business owners and all petite bourgeois peasants who own their own land and such. Whereas, on the other hand, the Marxist-Leninist tradition embodied by the Comintern advocated what was called a popular front strategy of communists seeking to win the support of the middle classes and the so-called petite bourgeoisie, and have them as a basis actually against fascism, you see. What distinguished the Popular Front from the old United Front in the 1930s is exactly this stance of collaborating with the petite bourgeoisie and the ambiguous sections of the masses, not just the urban propertyless proletariat. Marxism-Leninism, as opposed to Trotskyism, has faith in the middle strata, whereas Trotsky only saw hope in the poorest of the poor, and, this is the ironic part, and the advanced intellectuals. So this obsession with the most marginalised and most vulnerable being led by a bourgeois intellectual class permeates all Western leftist class analysis, which is totally different from the working class institutions Marxism-Leninism seeks to create, which lifts people up and allows that lowest of the low to rise up through the ranks. Instead, the Trotskyists have a focus on gatekeeping and purity checks and siding with the most perfectly oppressed underdogs as their warped model of purity, and idealising that as some sort of moral or normative perfection. Marxism-Leninism, though, understands the need to work with moderate sections of society, which will not be completely dependent on you, and that they do have a degree of independence. And independence in thought and opinions as well. Because they're not just starving, but just about subsisting, they cannot be blackmailed to accept anything you say without question just to survive, just so you chuck them a piece of bread to fight for you, as Trotsky sought to do with the most desperate. It means that you have to actually enter a dialogue. By not just relying on the most dependent, you have to be able to prove the correctness of what you are saying to them. The middle strata won't just accept what you say like vulnerable people might. They have to come to accept it on their own terms and be convinced genuinely in their hearts. Compared to Trotsky's view of the base of fascism being the supposed petite bourgeoisie and middle class, Marxist-Leninists believe that it is the ruling imperialist bourgeoisie. We don't despise and look down on the masses like antisocial, conceited intellectuals. We don't just want to manipulate the homeless or something like that because they'll just follow whatever the leader says, not being able to think about things in their own way. The irony inherent in this is that this Trotskyist outlook uses the same mechanism used by real fascism, with the bourgeoisie's usage of a lumpen. Of course, the Marxiites apply this to geopolitics to make themselves look moral by siding with the lowest and the most underdog nations of the world when they are oppressed, but all of a sudden opposing them as soon as they start to build alternative bases of power outside the US unipole. I mean, look at the so-called Western Maoists, who are nothing more than Trotskyists, who distance themselves from China as soon as they stop being just an underdog. But really, this could be a video all of its own, so I'd say it's a matter for another day. However, because of this aforementioned relative independence, the peasant subjectivity as a form of consciousness can be understood by how difficult it is for that person to be manipulated, which is why Trotskyites don't like them. The opposite to the peasant subjectivity is the urban institutions, the university circles within the cities, which are detached from the material necessity out of which authentic social bondage is formed. In urban life, all kinds of experimentation was allowed, but only possible because of a steady grain feeding them by those in the rural life, those peasants living in regimented lifestyles, set in their ways, doing the same thing over and over and over, repetitively in their traditional communities. And that's what even allows the cities to become avant-garde, conceited or snobby towards the people in the first place. Now, agriculture and grain itself doesn't have any privileged significance in determining someone to be a part of a peasantry, but was a large historical site of a peasantry in many places throughout the world. For in the countryside, sociological relationships have endured even throughout the changes in modes of production. However, even in post-agrarian countries, Mao and his groundbreaking understanding of the peasantry as not just a, but the revolutionary class is not redundant, for there exists a peasant consciousness and people who supply that which is necessary for the sustenance of institutions. It's the same dynamic. Industry and factory work actually came in large part to replace agriculture in terms of the relationship it bears to urbanity, and became a kind of rurality even within the cities themselves. So you have this dialectic of rural and urban even within one city. Within one city, walking through a deprived housing estate compared to the gentrified business or university areas in the centre contains this same dialectic. You cannot walk through such an estate and say, oh, these are just all urbanites, just like the central business district. There's definitely a dialectic going on there. So today, this rural-urban distinction, we could say, is more based on a relationship to institutions. The spaces considered urban are those which are directly controlled by institutions, where they can exercise their social governance and engineering, where life reflects institutions. But like I said, even within a city, say in such a working class housing estate, a university in its propaganda and rhetoric, and acceptable beliefs, whatever, it has no influence over the people there or their hearts, compared to how it would over its own students and staff on its campus, or even the polite and civilised professionals in the city centre who will conform to its line. Institutional narratives cannot be adopted by the peasantry. They will never embrace it. The rural is kept in check only by brute political power, forcing them to toe the line, at least superficially, or to keep quiet about what they think. Not because they've been convinced in their hearts, but out of fear. The hearts and minds of the rural people are simply outside of the reach of institutions, or trying to look moral or virtue-seeking like people in urban areas care about, the things that make the urban people conform without the direct coercion. Rather, these areas are governed by the gun and the threat of punishment. Law enforcement are way more severe in rural places for keeping people in line, as they are not ones domesticated by institutions like the urban people are, who can be quietened with a threatening sounding letter, poster or speech. This means on the one hand, they are more willing to question headlines, politicians, official decrees, enforced policies, but you also have to go to the effort to make a case to convince them too, because they are sceptical minds and don't just automatically share your own consciousness. And there's a risk that such skepticism can also often be directed into psyop conspiracies by glowy actors, which satisfies their distrust of institutions but redirects the target of their questioning to false scapegoats or ridiculous caricatures to alienate them from others and make them look ridiculous and insane, when really the skeptical mind that they have, their instinct is correct. So we must be steadfast like Mao, who understood the peasants as revolutionary compared to the urban dwellers. The working class did not just replace the peasantry, which is now somehow gone in this idea of a linear stage, this view with feudalism becoming capitalism, becoming socialism. Mao has not been rendered irrelevant by less people living in the countryside or something like that. In fact, a full understanding of Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought is more relevant and sorely needed today than ever in understanding the forces and tendencies and attitudes at play in our current environment. In the post-war period, the working class and peasantry both end up merging under the new universal state, which guarantees them a form of socialised security in owning some means of subsistence for themselves, delegated to them. The working class merges with the peasantry in the sense that this new class is both the vital source of surplus value, which is what has defined the proletariat, and also, at the same time, the vital source by which institutions replenish their social power, which is what has been defining the peasantry. Like the peasantry, it is outside of institutions, whilst at the same time, it is the very source of the institution's power. Without them, the institutions die. This class teaches us that the peasant is not just defined by a specific relation to agriculture, but more so is defined by being moulded by a sociality that is naturally and organically emerging, one which is material and earthly, that's not just imposed artificially. So they're less controlled by institutional narratives. Their sociality is one every day that gets reproduced naturally and from the soil. This is because these people represent the real material basis of social relations, cultural values, moral norms, social bonds, etc., etc. This is the lost foundation of our society, which we must return to. That is revolutionary. It's a very dialectical logic, you see. Return to the repressed origins of our society to bring in the new. Don't just look to the most hypermodern phenomenon and get behind the bandwagon of that. In cities, specifically institutions like government and universities, the relations, culture, bonds, norms and roles are contrived artificially and they're merely mimicry. They're role-playing. It's got no real roots. They do not understand innately in the form of labour what reality actually is, which the peasantry does. Even if they do not have an explicit form of communist consciousness explaining it, they innately understand it. The urbanites do not care to investigate the true nature of reality, but aspire to determine what it morally should be, ought to be, ethically, and impose their view by discourse, by institutional change, by slogans, by laws, etc. But to impose a narrative onto reality, which those who see the realities of the world day in and day out and live with it as their basic baseline, they just see it as frivolous. It's ridiculous and impossible to them because those realities and norms and cultural values are being generated every day. They can't just be changed by a decree or a formalistic piece of paper. So we see the Maoist significance of the peasantry has never gone away. We must return to the true base upon which these institutions of civil society has been built, and in fact this is exactly what Pol Pot was trying to do when he deepened the application of Mao Zedong thought by returning to the village life, to the origins of his country society, culture and norms, to use this as the reliable basis for future development. We need to return to the repressed origins of our society, lying dormant within this modern day peasantry, haunting our country, but being tyrannised by a minority who try to impose their own contrived social and moral and cultural and ethical values onto them. We need to return to the side of the production of material sociality itself, year zero for a fresh development along socialist lines. This is not to say we just want to go back to medieval times or we're against modernity, but rather by returning to the peasantry, we can unleash a pure and uniquely communist chart of development and navigation through modernity, unaffected and untainted, and surpass technologically the bourgeois modern societies, whilst not denying all that makes us human, our culture, our norms, our colour and vibrancy. It's a form of inclusive modernity. Communism cannot get anywhere in the West without a correct understanding of Mao Zedong thought. This is a core value, a core point of why we call ourselves the Maoist cultural promoters, because we do believe that not every organisation has to be explicitly Maoist, but we do believe that without this appreciation for the value and usage of Mao Zedong thought, you're going to have to discover all this stuff the hard way. So we want to popularise within the communities such as the Workers' Party or the American Communist Party, which already has this to a large extent, the understanding of the necessity of an appreciation for Mao Zedong thought, which is, in our view, the highest synthesis of Marxism, because we do sincerely believe that there is a significance and a necessity to it, because Marxism-Leninism alone would not be sufficient. And no, this does not mean that we support those who go under the banner of Maoist here already, who are third worldists, claiming that, you know, the working class in this country have no potential, no revolutionary potential. But what we want to do when we say we are Maoist is search for the class which represents the general form of labour, which after World War II had been what the political relationship between the state and people had been based around, and now has been abandoned, and our people just left for dead. The guarantee that the state made that most people would be able to come out of school without the need for university or becoming professionals, and would be guaranteed things like the ability to save and cheaply get their car, home, and that picket fence life where they'd be able to raise a family by working in a mill, factory or down a mine, and they could be afforded this sort of baseline standard of living. And now that the rug's been pulled under our people and our people just left to rot. During the 70s, all these jobs began to be outsourced overseas, and now the shadow of this once clear form of general labour looms, largely undressed in the West. It should be no wonder then that even if the semantics or the targets are wrong and reactionary, when someone like Trump or Farage comes and says the jobs are coming back, well, a lot of the working class follow them, and they end up authentically forming working class movements. It doesn't mean what they're saying is correct, but you have to think, why are so much of the working class interested in a rhetoric like that? Could we propose a more scientific one that actually attacks the real causes of their suffering? Because the problems that they have are real. We can't deny that. It originates from not necessarily immigration or anything like that, but the breaking of that post-war contract. And ever since then, people have been looking for answers, but their anger is often being conveniently misdirected. Class interest is expressed at the level of labour in general, not the small pool of the graduate workplace, which is where leftists try and do all their organising, but general labour is how you understand the interests of a working class, who is doing materially necessary labour as opposed to maybe what we could call socially necessary. Materially necessary, which is needed for our reproduction as human beings. It's important to not make this into a moralising thing with a class analysis. Whoever is not part of a working class is not necessarily evil or even privileged, rich or not working long and hard, which a lot of people who aren't working class are doing. Class is not based on how much you suffer, how much you're a perfectly oppressed person or your grievances. I mean, teachers and nurses, these are professionals, but they face plenty of that. However, they do not represent general labour, but the interests of people who are educated in a way that the majority of people in the country are not going to be. It is no condemnation of them personally or morally or anything that they've done, but our strategy cannot limit itself to them as a base only. Like when doctors act, for example, they do so on the basis of their interests as doctors, which of course it is only a natural thing, but then they are doing that insofar as it represents the barrier of entry that exists to that profession, which is not one that is available for a broad strata of the population. Although they too face economic issues in common with the working class, like rising heating and electricity costs, fuel prices and such, many professionals endure tight hours, unfair pay according to the rising cost of living, so they may have a proximity to the movement, but cannot be relied on to form the core. The core must be the small holding worker peasant subject, and that is the significance of Mao today in the West. Thank you all kindly for giving me your attention, and until the next time, farewell.